Ladies and gentlemen, and thank you, Peter. Thank you to the Commission for the invitation to UNDP that we have the chance to give our views here. And first, I'd like to say we welcome very much the blueprint you put on the table. I think we really need to congratulate you on the comprehensive assessment you have done with it, which is attached to it, which is not all seen in the main document, and the concrete proposals for action, which I will come to also a bit in my presentation. My title is Water, the Blue Gold of the 21st Century. Well, you will not see in the future the central banks of the countries having water stored in their cellars instead of gold. This is not what I mean here. But of course you will see that water will be one of the key limiting factors of economic development, and that is what we see already in China happening today. That is why they start to act. And that it will be more precious to people who don't have it, more precious than gold. Well, Fritz already said, well, we face a global water crisis at this moment. It's due to overexploitation, pollution, and we don't have the sufficient access to drinking water and sanitation. Well, you all know the figures around the MDGs. I don't want to repeat them here. Well, we think we have achieved the MDG on drinking water, so there is good progress on it. We are bad on sanitation. We are not on track. We have to accelerate our action, and the UN has come out with a framework on it. But we have always to realize, even if we have to achieve the MDGs, there are still half of the people not there with access to drinking water and sanitation. And that is what we have to address in the future, post-2015, and that is what we also have to address when we discuss the SDGs. But with regard to the SDGs, I'm very happy to hear that Hungary next year will do a quite large conference on discussing the SDGs from the water perspective. Well, we already face a crisis, ladies and gentlemen, and the pressure is increasing every day. By 2030, we would need 50% more food, 45% more energy, 30% more water. And, which is a very interesting figure, we will have by 2030 3 billion more middle-class people asking for all kinds of resources. And they will not ask, let's say, for 2 liters of water or for 3 liters per day. They will ask for much more. And if you see the economic growth happening in China, that's around 10 times faster than the economic growth was of England during the Industrial Revolution. And this is putting a lot of pressure. The key drivers, let's say, for accelerating this crisis is climate change, land use change, probably even today much bigger, population growth, demographic change, urbanization and migration, that is one block, and changing of consumption patterns. For example, the consumption increase in China of meat at the moment because they changed their diets from more vegetarian to much more meat, has serious consequences on, let's say, on the global water resources. So the global picture doesn't look very good, and I'd like to comment on a few of these issues. Only a few highlights. Climate change. Climate change is not a theoretical threat, as some people still think. It's happening today, and we see the effects already in developing countries, in more droughts, floods, and so on. The bad thing is, well, the developing countries, the poor countries are more affected at this moment than the rich countries, and of course they don't have the means. So they need real support on, let's say, on adaptation. We are very grateful that the European Union is doing a lot of support in that respect, and we hope that you keep this support and even increase it, and we also hope that the actions around, let's say, support for finance, for technology and for expertise, because they need all of the three, gets more concerted between the Commission and the Member States. I think this is one of the quite important points. Land use change, ladies and gentlemen. Land use change is probably today has a much larger effect on the water cycle and on water than climate change has now. I only want to raise one issue which I would have expected that the blueprint covers that. Trans-European water cycle changes. Issues which cannot be dealt by one member state alone. They should be reflected in European action. One issue is that we know large forest cover is responsible for atmospheric transport of moisture from oceans to the continent. That happens from the Atlantic towards the continent, towards Russia. The Eurasian forest belt is the biggest forest belt globally. But at the moment, a size of half of Germany is cut down every year. This forest belt is like a moisture pump, which pumps moisture from the Atlantic, let's say, over Europe, and mainly responsible for the water cycle in Europe. If this pump stops, it will have severe consequences on the water cycle in Europe, threatening probably all the efforts and all the achievements we have done in the past on water management. Therefore, I think the European Union should really have a very serious look on this. The third driver, population growth, urbanization, is not an issue in the EU as such, but you have demographic changes, and you will have migration issues also because of climate change. And I think I very strongly encourage the Commission in the follow-up of the blueprint that you look into these issues, because this is one key driver also in Europe with regard to infrastructure, pricing policies, and land use effects. Comments on a few response issues. Demand management. Demand management is a key for the entire global water management in the future. And we hope that the EU would really lead the way into this, let's say, different approach that we were in the past mainly supply-driven in our management approaches. But we strongly encourage the Commission to go beyond guidance. At the moment, they only have this as guidance. I think it really earns a legally binding instrument which can complement the Water Framework Directive and really sets very clear rules on allocation, on accounting, on ecological flows, on reuse recycling, and on water transfers. I think that is, you don't have to set, let's say, it quantitatively, but I think the rules can be set on a European level, and that would help internationally a lot in the discussion as well. And the stewardship instrument, what the European Water Partnership has developed, the tool to assess basically the sustainability of industrial sites on how sustainable they are with water, can be instrumental in a demand management approach. Integration. Well, it's very clear, and it was said by the Commissioner yesterday, the EU didn't succeed in this issue, integrating water and environment policies in the other policy areas such as energy and agriculture. And energy is not addressed enough, I think, in the blueprint. We are very happy that it is addressed as an issue in the blueprint, and the Commissioner also committed, let's say, heavily yesterday that he will continue his efforts on that. Why are we so eager for that? Because we see very negative effects in developing countries of some of the EU policies, for example, on the biofuel policy. Well, land grabbing is partly because of the EU policy on these issues. So the water policy and the whole land use policy is affected over there by the EU policies, let's say, set out in Europe and for Europe. So in general terms, we would really like to see much more efforts in policy coherence also for development. Water and security. We were very happy to hear that Ms. Ashton has put this on the agenda. Unfortunately, the blueprint doesn't look into that, into the issue of security. We understand that because in terms of the EU as such, it's probably at the moment not such an issue, but I think it's an issue with regard to the neighborhood, and in particular with the Mediterranean. The EU has very important lessons, let's say, which they have learned in transboundary management on the large river basin. If you look globally, water has not led to water wars. It has led to global, let's say, to local conflicts. It was a lot of the time the reason why dialogue between conflicting nations continued. And we hope that this will stay in the future. But in the future, the situation can change. And Fritz Holzwarth talked about the nexus. And the conflicts of the future might be nexus conflicts. where you have energy issues, food security issues, and water security as one thing, and together they are probably enough then to cause, let's say, real conflicts. We very much strongly encourage the EU to be a thought and practice leader, let's say, in this issue on water security, and in particular as a first step to ratify the UN Water Course, let's say, convention immediately, because that has a very good conflict resolution mechanism, which some of the countries already use today, and which would be extremely happy with regard to the water and security issue. International issues. The blueprint puts up the issue of virtual water. If you look at it, of course, I think it's a very nice communication tool to tell to the people, well, 1 cup of coffee has 45 or 50 liters of water in it. But what does that mean? What is the consequence? Is the consequence that you don't import coffee anymore into the EU because you don't want to import that much water? So you have to be extremely careful with the policy consequences if you put this out as a major communication. The response to that is, no, you should help the developing countries to become more sustainable on, let's say, on their management, when they in their agriculture, when they do on the coffee plantations, for example. So this is the response, let's say, to that issue. But we have to be very careful how we use this. One word to the water initiative. It remains very unclear what the Commission and the European Union wants to do with it. I think it has some success stories, but it delivered 750 million euros additional money on water via the EU Water Facility. The buy-in of the member states was not very good, although it was signed up in Johannesburg by the highest possible delegation of the European Union. The buy-in of the member state is still not very good, and we really don't understand that. The work, for example, on the Nexus could happen on this platform. This platform is there. This platform could be used. This platform could be used for accelerated work with the private sector, for example, which is more and more interested in working in the field of development. And it would be a platform to address the security issues as well. So I think the member states and the Commission should get much more clear than it's today. What are you going to do with this initiative, and how are you organizing, let's say, your global water agenda? That remains largely unclear. Ladies and gentlemen, I've put out a few issues. There are many others which should be addressed normally. But at the end of the day, I would like to put one issue up which is absolutely crucial if we want to solve the global water crisis. And that is the value of water. If we don't start valuing water in all its dimension, and that is a message which should go also to the other sector, in its economic, ecological, in its environmental and its cultural dimension. If we don't start valuing that, then we will not be able to solve this crisis. This is a very soft issue, but this will be in the core of the change of the paradigm, how we deal with this, let's say, today. And let me close with a sentence of Albert Einstein, who says, "You cannot solve the problem with the same thinking which created it." Thank you very much.
Thank you, Fritz. Well, let's say I don't think we should not get into the theory of relativity here. Let's try and stay closer to Earth. And you know, I'm wondering. I've listened very carefully to what you have both said, and it is clear, of course, I think from both of your interventions that what happens outside the EU is important for us inside the EU. It is also important, I think, from a point of view of security, migration, and all sorts of things, that to realize that, of course, we cannot exist in a clean water island in Europe in a sea of dirty water, or lack of water, of no water. And therefore thinking of Fritz's cogwheels, you know, when the cogwheels turn in the developing countries, what are the consequences for the EU? How does our consumption, for example, drive the cogwheels in the developing countries? Some of the wheels turn here, some of the wheels turn in the developing countries. And what can we do to help the process in the developing countries? You know, what should the EU concretely do to help this? I mean, Fritz was talking about moving from the integrated water resources management to a nexus concept. I see it as integrated water resources management has to be part of a nexus thinking. But what should the EU concretely do? Do you have any ideas about things that we should take home and present to our development colleagues? You know, what kind of action should we take vis-à-vis the developing countries?
The first thing, Peter, what I see is at the moment that DG Development, I don't see any colleagues here, but of course DG Development has very nicely put agriculture and energy on the agenda and as top priorities, but water is not there. And the nexus approach is also not there. There seems to be a belief that if we solve the energy issue, well, the water issue will fall in place just like that. And this is something I think where we are happy to work jointly with you, because if this is the case that the EU doesn't prioritize water in its development issue, well, you will see that the ministers in the developing countries will look at that and say, okay, then, okay, if the EU doesn't even do it, so we don't do it either. Yeah, and water is complicated in its implementation. Locally, sanitation is not very sexy. Talking, you will not be able to win elections with talking about toilets. But if the EU doesn't put this as a priority, I think that is the first step what you need to do here.
So you're suggesting there's a, so we call it a color blindness issue here. Fritz?
I think if we see what kind of experience we have in water management in Europe, then the important thing is that we have to change things on the ground. And I think what we learned in Europe is that we have a kind of triangle which is independent. This is setting standards and having a good governance structure. The second thing is that not only set standards, this is done in a lot of countries all over the world, make clear that standards are only implemented if they are enforced. And the third part is that you have to see that in addition to that, technology is important. So I think we cannot take the Water Framework Directive as a kind of blueprint for China or for Africa. But the pattern underlying this, this water policy, I think, this is something what we can do in the context of what we call capacity building. So I think there are possibilities to change things. But what is also clear, and this applies especially for the development policy, and I know what I am talking about. We will not change things if we are not really mentioning the issue of corruption. Corruption is a crucial issue in the whole field of water. And I know from our first Bonn Water Conference in 2001, we had in the preparation phase a big debate if we should put corruption on the agenda. And we did it at the very end. And I think this is a long-term issue. But without fighting against corruption in water, you will change nothing if you have good technologies, if you have administrative patterns. And my last point is, Fritz, if you go to Africa, you can really win elections with sanitation issues. This is something. Yeah. This is because these are really vital things. If you go to schools where you have not an adequate sanitation, who is suffering from that? It's not the boys, it's the girls. And you can go through all these issues. So I would not underestimate sanitation, and I'm really grateful that we have been able to put sanitation on a prominent role in this debate. This was not expected that we are able to do that because drinking water supply is a cleaner and more comfortable issue. But this I would like to say that sanitation we should not underestimate.
Thank you, Fritz. Do you want to comment?
Well, I think this is crucial that we always address the drinking water issue, the sanitation issue, and the management issue together. Yeah, that we don't isolate it, and that we put the capacity building as well in the forefront. However, what we have seen in the last 20 years, I would say 20 years ago, the focus of development policy was on infrastructure. Yeah, we did a lot of infrastructure in Africa, but we forgot the capacity side and we forgot the governance side. So we have put a lot of hardware in it, which you can, I can show you in almost every country in Africa, the ruins, let's say, of the 70s and 80s in infrastructure. Then we had a swing in the other direction. In the 90s, we did a lot of soft issues. So we thought, okay, capacity and governance and all of that. And in the meanwhile, we forgot, let's say, the investment side. And I think that is coming back, and that is very urgent that this is always combined and that we offer really investment opportunities. The problem here is very often in the developing countries the financial engineering capacity to make projects really bankable, to let's say bring them up to a real size which is interesting, let's say for investors. On the other hand, we have to realize Africa is developing fast at the moment. The growth rates are amazing. Zambia has just put a bond out for 700 million euros, no problem. 50 times override in a very fast time. So the investors go there, but of course they need support on the investment side. Let's say how you do that and how you spend the money, and so there they really need support for example on the financial engineering, and of course let's say on the capacity side to implement this money in the right way.
Thank you. I think one final question from my side before we open up for the floor, and that is, I mean, Fritz, when you spoke about the nexus, I mean, this made me think of the Commission's communication about a resource-efficient Europe, because what you were talking about was scarcity of resources and how we cannot afford to waste food because this makes us waste energy, it makes us waste water. So the interlinkages between these different components, every time we draw water, we implicitly use other resources, and you underlined the global growth that we can expect in the next 30 to 50 years. How are we going to, should we be doing anything vis-a-vis the developing countries more broadly on resource efficiency?
I think this goes in the right direction, but there is, from my point of view, a gap in this system, because resource efficiency is related normally to technology. And what is fully ignored in this context, that technology on its own solves nothing. So the important thing is that you need an adequate governance structure where this resource efficiency strategy is embedded. And from this point of view, I think there are a lot of possibilities. Efficiency in water in developing countries, if you go in the arid or semi-arid zones, there is a lot to do. But on the other hand side, it's also clear you need technology, and technology is an element which you can't get for granted, where you have to pay for. So the things are interlinked. Now we are back to our colleague from yesterday on economics. So there are interlinkages, and I think the direction is clear, but it should be embedded in an adequate governance structure also in developing countries.
Well, of course, on some of the natural resources at the moment, we face, well, the global boundaries. They're not abundant, and we already face competition. Well, you all know what China is doing in Africa. They see that as their backyard for natural resources, and they act accordingly in Africa. So what is vital for the European Union, let's say not to go the Chinese road, but to present themselves as a real partner. Let's say in looking at this issue in a very close partnership, because it's a global issue. Yeah, it's a global issue on the resource shortages and the global boundaries on various resources, and the partnership, and a very strategic partnership, for example, with the African side, which is the starting point is there. But I think this is extremely crucial for the European Union, not only in sub-Saharan Africa, but this becomes more vital now as we see that the US is pulling back from, let's say, from the Middle East and the Mediterranean, that the European Union is very strong in this area as a real strategic partner, let's say, and not only as somebody who looks at these resources from its own, let's say, from a backyard point of view, like the Chinese.
Thank you, Fritz. I open the floor. Any questions? Yes, I can see. Yes, David, yeah, please. Can I ask everyone who takes the floor to say who they are and where they come from?
David Zetlin, Wageningen University. I'm very interested in this topic, as you might expect. This is my bread and butter. I have a few comments in responses to both Fritz's, I would suppose. As a first pre-comment, I would say that anybody who is interested in the land-water nexus and the political economy of that should give me their card, and I'll email you a chapter just published on that issue in Africa. And there is, in fact, of course, a huge connection with water resources. I'm very worried about these discussions of especially when the word nexus comes up and the way we should manage things comes up. And I want to point out a couple of problems that have come from what I will call over-managed development programs. The Millennium Development Goal for clean water, for example, was originally stated as they will have the number of people who without access to clean water, and that was then redefined to say without access to an improved water source, which doesn't necessarily mean clean water. And I tell people all the time that it's not 1 billion people who lack access to clean water, it's more like 3 billion people, according to estimates I've seen. And this is a problem, I think, that the bureaucrats took the easy way out, and there are still 3 billion people who are lacking water, and that program is now successful and is going to be closing down, I'm assuming, although those people are not necessarily going to have water. The second thing, of course, there is no such thing as a global resource where water is concerned. It's a local resource, and local management is what we're talking about here in terms of the EU, and local management will matter in all these different countries around the world. So it's important, of course, to keep track of the bottom-up aspect of water management. Local people are actually quite good at managing their water resources. If we look at failures in water projects around the world in most countries, almost all of them are top-down initiatives. And the United States, of course, is littered with many, many failures of water management from well-meaning, potentially well-meaning, sometimes corrupt top-down managers. And when it comes to the nexus, I'll have to say that I think that the water, energy, food, development, environment, etc. nexus is far too complicated for any organization or individual, of course, to manage. I tend to say that we don't have a problem with a wine and cheese nexus because people are managing wine and cheese using sustainable market forces. Water is clearly not a pure market product, as we talked about yesterday. But I tend to say that if we manage water in a sustainable way, energy will take care of itself because they're quite good at managing themselves. And if the biofuel policy comes out that subsidizes the production of corn for ethanol or soya for biofuel, and they're using too much water, then sustainable water managers will reduce that too much water problem so that there will not be a spillover, a negative spillover that this nexus people fear. And I put this in the context that if we can't manage, for example, water quality and water quantity right now, then what makes us think we could also manage that jointly with energy and with food and with climate? Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions to the speakers? Yes?
Yeah, my name is Gunnar Norén, Coalition Clean Baltic, Environmental NGOs. We know here that basic sanitation services has been declared, as a human right, very much, and we're having now the global perspective. But I would also like to say, when we look in European Union, even, we know that there is between 10 to 20 million people that don't have proper sanitation. And it's mainly then from the new EU member states, from the eastern countries. So I think we have to deal with it also here on our own region in a way. And the problem, as I see with this, is that the Urban Wastewater Treatment Directive is working then down to settlements with 2,000 person equivalents. And below this is a national more responsibility, and it's not dealt with the Commission. But I think European Commission need to deal with this problem, and they need to give some guidance to member states so we can also see a solution for this problem the coming years in Europe. And I would like to ask you in the panel, what's your views on this? How do you think European Union shall deal with this? Thank you.
Here was a question to the panel. Maybe I can start by saying that there is actually an ongoing activity to address this issue. It has been discussed in the context of the Drinking Water Directive that there's an issue with small drinking water supplies. And of course the issue with small drinking water supplies is that there is no separation of, so we call it excrements, and drinking water supply. In large parts of small communities, in particular in the new member states, but not only in the new member states, I hasten to say. So there is an activity ongoing there to address that particular issue.
Yeah, well, that's absolutely right, Peter. There is still the issue of that the shit sits beside the well. This is still a reality in a lot of the Eastern European countries. And I think we have to address it. One thing what I see is that the solutions are very often very small scale problems which cannot be funded by EU money because EU funded projects have to be large scale. So something has to be done there, either group the projects and programs or something on the funding side. I think there is a need for action here on that, let's say on the funding mechanisms that you can tackle these issues efficiently because we know how to deal with it. And so I think it's a question to look at these issues to solve the problems. Well, on the MDGs, just to be clear, well, of course, we are fully aware of, let's say, of these type of problems, what you mentioned, and that is why the UN, and in particular UNDP, is strongly promoting acceleration and an acceleration framework. That is why we have come up with this. And On water being a local issue, of course, water management is very local, normally. But as I pointed out, there are global issues, such as transcontinental water cycle changes, which we also have to look at. And this is not a local issue. This is an issue where, which in the future we have to all look together, European-wide and beyond, let's say, the European Union.
In relation to the sanitation issue, I only like to say that we come step by step to a conclusion that we have to look, especially in rural areas, in more decentralized solutions than in comparison what we doing normally. And I also like to say the implementation of the Urban Wastewater Treatment Directive took all in all 20 years for us, so we shouldn't overstress the developments in new member states in this case, because if you look some years back, it's also clear it took a lot of time, and we had been in financing these developments in Germany, but also in other old EU countries, in a relatively comfortable situation that we had been able, through the way to finance it, to speed it up. I think there is also a rethinking in the EU context, and this is the right way. I would like to come back what David said. The issue of overmanaged development policy. It is clear for us that we cannot put the nexus as a whole, as a kind of umbrella above all the various sector policies. What is important and what is a problem of integrated water resources management, the responsibility for actions and measures have to stay in the sectors. There is not an overarching administration managing the nexus. If we would do that, we will fail. I'm convinced that we will fail. But if we have no understanding about the interdependencies in this context, then I think we will also fail, and we will continue to replicate the failures of the past. And last but not least, the Lighthouse Project, which is developed at the moment by the World Bank on water and energy, food is outside for the moment. And there are also other pilot projects, I would put it this way, pilot projects, how we can materialize and operationalize this issue. I think there is also time needed to learn from such projects, and this is not a quick solution we can go for. But I think if we stay with an lack of understanding about the interdependencies, then I think we will fail. We have at the moment, you are referring to smaller projects. We have at the moment in the Mekong Basin a heavy debate about the Xayaburi Dam, and I can understand the Laotian government that they like to build a dam and to export the energy they are producing. There is an economic issue in. But at the same time, 80% of the protein in the region, a lot of people do not know that, are coming from fisheries in the Mekong. If you build the dam and you reduce the possibility for fishing in the Mekong, this has major negative impacts for the whole region. The same applies if it comes to rice production in the delta. So therefore, for me, it's not an overarching administration we need, but what we need is a different understanding we have today, and this is a bit a very general saying, but we have to change mindsets in this context. And we had not been able to change mindsets through integrated water resources management. This is why I think this makes things so difficult.
Thank you. We have now, unfortunately, arrived at the end of our session, so I could see there was one more question down there, but I think you will have to do that maybe during the lunch break. If you have another question, I will briefly try and wrap up here. This is, of course, a very wide-ranging subject. We've had a lot of messages that we will take back home. I think, firstly, we had a discussion about the nexus, about the interdependency of water, food, and energy. And I think this is one of the messages that we will take back to our colleagues who deal more with development than we do, is that you cannot manage energy or you cannot manage food without managing water because of the cogwheels that we saw. We also take home, I think, Fritz Barth's message about land use. Land use are things that we are working on already. We are aware of these, shall we say, global continental drivers of the big water cycle, but we do not feel that we have enough knowledge yet to propose any concrete action in this area. We take home from this debate, I think, that when dealing with developing countries, that there are a number of issues that we need to deal with. Standards, governance, technology, capacity building, in other words. We need to deal with the whole issue of investment. We need also, I think, to deal with the issue of corruption. Corruption is not just bad for EU finances and the use of EU citizens' money in terms of development assistance. It is also bad in terms of the results in the developing countries, that it leads to perverse results of development projects. I take home also the message that the EU should live up to its responsibilities as a credible strategic partner in areas such as Africa, in areas such as the Mediterranean, the Middle East, and possibly also other areas. And finally, that we still have issues in our own backyard that we need to settle, and maybe I should remind what I normally do with this. There was somebody who said that the Urban Wastewater Directive only applies to things above 2000 PE, as it's called in the language, and this is not actually the case, because there is a not very well-known article in the directive that says that smaller areas need to be subject to appropriate treatment, and it needs to be considered what appropriate treatment means. So there's a bit of homework for ourselves to do, and well, thankfully this homework is already on the way. There's a cooperation between the Commission and the Member States to address this because of the problems that have arisen in the implementation of the Drinking Water Directive. So with this, I close this session. Thank you, all of you, for your patience in waiting for us to open it, and to listening to the interventions and your participation in the debate. Now, the bad news is that there's no coffee break now. We go directly to the next session.
That's bad news, really.
Yes.